The elevator doors opened to the 40th floor with a soft, melodic chime that usually signaled the start of Naomi Carter's invisible hours. She stepped onto the polished obsidian floor of the foyer, her gray uniform crisp, her mind running through a mental checklist. pH-neutral cleaner for the Calicut marble, microfiber for the floor-to-ceiling glass, and absolute silence for the man who paid her to be a ghost. Naomi had mastered the art of existing without being noticed. To the elite of Chicago, she was a domestic technician, a moving shadow that erased fingerprints and smoothed out the wrinkles of lives far more expensive than her own. She did it for the tuition bills stacking up for her sister and the quiet survival of a woman who knew that in this city, the safest place to be was overlooked. But as she pushed her supply cart toward the living area of Unit 402, the sterile scent of expensive citrus was gone. In its place was something thick, metallic, and warm. The tech mogul, Kang Min-yi, wasn't sitting at his desk. He was slumped against the base of a white leather sofa, pinned to the floor by a bullet. A sprawling, jagged map of crimson was soaking into a hand-woven silk rug that cost more than Naomi's childhood home. The silence she usually cultivated had turned into a vacuum. She stood frozen, a bottle of glass cleaner in her hand, looking down at a man who looked like a fallen prince in a ruined $5,000 suit. She expected him to be a victim, a businessman caught in a robbery. But when his eyes flickered open, dark, lethal, and pulsing with a terrifying lucidity, she realized she hadn't been cleaning the home of a CEO. She had been maintaining the sanctuary of a king whose empire was built on blood, and now that she had seen him bleed, her life of invisibility was over. The rhythmic hiss-click of the antiseptic spray was the only sound in the penthouse, a domestic white noise that Naomi used to tether herself to reality. Min-yi lay motionless on the sofa, his face the color of the marble floors he owned. He hadn't asked her name, and she hadn't offered it. In the high-end service world, names were for people who stayed. Naomi was someone who erased herself as she went. She reached into her supply cart, moving past the heavy-duty degreaser to find the small, battered first aid kit she kept for her own blistered heels. Her mind raced back to her childhood kitchen, the smell of menthol and the steady hands of her mother, a woman who had stitched up half the neighborhood because the ER was a place where questions were asked. "I'm going to have to cut the shirt," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her pulse. Min-yi didn't open his eyes. "Do it, just keep the blood off the silk. It's a limited edition." The dark humor felt like a slap. He was dying, and he was worried about the upholstery. Naomi took the heavy tailoring shears from her kit and sliced through the ruined fabric. Beneath the $5,000 wool was a map of old scars, jagged lines that told a story of a man who had been a target long before today. This wasn't a business wound. It was a professional one. As she cleaned the entry point, the weight of the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of a maid working in an empty room. It was the silence of two people trapped in a fortress of glass, waiting for the world outside to realize the king was down, and the ghost was the only one left to guard the gate. The high-tech sanctuary of Unit 402 transformed under Naomi's hands, stripped of its minimalist soul to become something raw and functional. The sleek Boffy kitchen, usually reserved for Nespresso pods and untouched mineral water, now boiled with stainless steel pots. The air, once scented with filtered ozone, grew thick with the sharp, medicinal sting of rubbing alcohol and the humid weight of steam. Naomi moved with a practiced, rhythmic economy, tapping heavy plastic sheeting over the white silk rug, a makeshift surgical field that felt more like a crime scene. As the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor, the tension in the room shifted from the physical to the existential. Min-yi lay on the kitchen island, his jaw clamped tight against a fresh wave of agony. In the harsh, overhead-led glow, the divide between them seemed to vanish. "You're good at this," he murmured, his voice a ghost of its former command. "Hiding in plain sight, operating in the gaps." Naomi didn't look up from where she was prepping a needle. "I've had a lifetime of practice, Mr. Kang. People like me, maids, janitors, the help, were the background noise of the world. You're only noticing me now because the music stopped." Min-yi let out a breath that sounded like a confession. "And people like me? We're only powerful as long as the world believes we're invincible. The moment we bleed, we're just as invisible as you." In the cooling silence of the first night, they sat as two versions of the same truth. The woman who was never seen and the man who could no longer afford to be. As Naomi began the first stitch, she realized they weren't just protecting his life. They were guarding a secret that made them both dangerous. The rain began to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the Chicago skyline into a smear of gray neon. Inside, the only light came from the dim glow of the kitchen's under-cabinet LEDs, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to pull Naomi and Minyi into the same dark corner of the world. He was sitting up now, propped against the island, his movements stiff and deliberate. "In the asterisk K-Campy asterisk," Minyi said, his voice dropping into a register that felt like a low-frequency warning. "Silence isn't just a preference. It's the currency of survival. If you speak a truth that hasn't been sanctioned, you forfeit your tongue. We live in the gaps of the law, and the gaps only stay open as long as no one breathes a word." Naomi paused, her hands resting on a stack of clean linens. She looked at him not as a client, but as a mirror. "You call it a code. I call it a job description. The maid's code is unwritten, but it's just as lethal. I've seen the contents of safes, the mistresses in the guest rooms, the ledgers that shouldn't exist. I move through these penthouses like I'm part of the furniture. The moment I become a person with a voice, I'm a liability. To be good at what I do, I have to be a grave." Minyi studied her, the predatory edge in his eyes softening into a grim, newfound respect. They were both architects of the unseen, one by command, the other by necessity. In the heavy electric quiet of the room, they realized they were bound by more than just a wound. They both lived by a singular, cold rule. The world only lets you exist as long as you keep its secrets better than it keeps its own. The chime of the elevator was the first warning, not the melodic bell of a guest, but the sharp, repetitive ping of a manual override. Shadows flickered beneath the frosted glass doors of the foyer. The K-Campy had come to finish the job. "They're here," Naomi breathed, the professional calm she had cultivated for a decade instantly sharpening into a jagged, survivalist edge. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for her master key card and a heavy flashlight. Min-Yi tried to stand, his hand clenching the marble counter until his knuckles turned white. "I can't run, Naomi. Leave me." "I don't run," she countered, pulling his arm over her shoulder. "I navigate." She didn't lead him toward the grand entrance or the service elevator. Instead, she kicked aside a decorative screen in the laundry suite, revealing the narrow, steel-slotted door to the building's internal guts. This was her world, the labyrinth of HVAC ducts, trash chutes, and maintenance tunnels that the residents never acknowledged. They moved through the dark, the air thick with the hum of machinery and the smell of industrial grease. Naomi knew every turn by the vibration of the pipes. While the hit squad searched the visible penthouse, she guided Min-Yi down 4 levels of service ladders and through a sub-basement exit that opened into a damp delivery alley. The city felt different at ground level, colder, louder, and more honest. As they limped toward her battered sedan, the glitz of the Upper East Side faded into the rear view. She wasn't taking him to a safe house or a hotel. She was taking him to the only place where a man like him could truly disappear, a neighborhood where the police didn't come, and the help were the only ones who held the keys. For the first time, the king was entering the ghost's domain. The air in Naomi's apartment didn't smell of filtered ozone or expensive citrus. It smelled of Murphy's oil soap, fried onions from the floor below, and the faint, persistent scent of a life lived on the margins. She cleared the mismatched mail and a half-finished crossword puzzle from the scarred oak kitchen table, the same table where she'd done her homework, and where her mother had once extracted a splinter from a neighbor's eye with the steady hands of a saint. Min-Yi sat heavily in a chair that creaked under his weight, his charcoal wool trousers incongruous against the linoleum floor. He looked around the cramped space, his gaze lingering on the faded photographs of Naomi's sister and the small, flickering votive candle on the counter. For the first time, the predator looked hunted. He was a king without a throne, stripped of the glass walls that usually acted as his armor. "My world doesn't reach here," he murmured, his breath hitching as Naomi peeled back the makeshift bandage. "Good," Naomi replied, dropping a needle into a pot of boiling water on the stove. Because in this neighborhood, a suit like yours is just a target. Here, you aren't the boss of anything. You're just a man who needs a stitch. The power dynamic shifted with the click of the stove's burner. Out on the street, a siren wailed and then faded, ignored by a community that had learned long ago that help rarely came from the outside. Min-Yi watched her, really watched her, as she prepped the thread. He saw the strength in her shoulders and the iron in her silence. He had spent his life commanding soldiers, but as Naomi leaned into the light to begin the surgery, he realized he was finally in the hands of an expert. He didn't belong here, and for the first time in his life, that was the only thing keeping him alive. The steam from the boiling pot on the stove began to fog the kitchen window, blurring the streetlights of the south side into halos of amber. Naomi focused on the steady pull of the needle, but her mind was elsewhere, retreating into the sensory library of a woman who was paid to notice what others ignored. "The men who came to the penthouse," Naomi said, her voice dropping into a low, clinical hum. "They weren't just looking for you. They knew exactly which floorboard in the study was loose. They knew the override code for the service lift." Min-Yi hissed as the thread tightened. "My inner circle is small, Naomi. They are blood." "Blood spills," she countered, looking him in the eye. "But habits remain. 3 months ago, I was detailing the vents in your private office. There was a smudge on the underside of your mahogany desk, a residue of expensive, hand-blended tobacco. It's a scent I've only smelled once before, bergamot and charred cedar." Min-Yi went rigid, his breath hitching not from the pain, but from the recognition. "Ju-1. He doesn't smoke," Naomi continued, her hands never wavering. "But he carries a vintage silver lighter. I found a single flake of that tobacco in the cuff of his trousers while I was pressing his suit for your merger gala. He was standing in your sanctuary, marking his territory while you were looking at the skyline." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a shattered brotherhood. Min-Yi had looked at Ju-1 and seen a loyal soldier. Naomi had looked at the floor and seen a traitor's footprint. In the dim light of her kitchen, the maid's code had finally unmasked the king's assassin. The silver elevator of the K-Campi headquarters climbed toward the penthouse, its mirrored walls reflecting a woman the world was trained to ignore. Naomi wore her charcoal service uniform, a heavy laundry bin balanced on her hip, her eyes downcast in the universal posture of the help. Beside her, hidden beneath a pile of Egyptian cotton linens and industrial-sized detergent bottles, Min-Yi lay silent, his hand gripped around a suppressed pistol. The doors chimed. Ju-1 stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, already draped in the mantle of a king, his back to the service entrance. He didn't even turn when Naomi entered. To him, she was just a ghost returning to its haunting grounds. "You're late with the linens," Ju-1 remarked, his voice smooth with the arrogance of a man who thought he'd already won. Naomi didn't answer. She set the bin down with a heavy thud, her movements precise and devoid of fear. She reached into the folds of the white fabric, not for a weapon, but for the master remote she had swiped from the maintenance closet. With a single click, the smart glass windows frosted over, plunging the suite into a disorienting, milky haze, and the electronic locks engaged with a synchronized snap. "What is this?" Ju-1 spun around, his hand flying to his holster, but he was staring at a maid. "The trash is overdue," Naomi said, her voice like cold iron. As she stepped aside, the linen erupted. Min-Yi rose from the bin like a vengeful shadow, the ghost's Trojan horse finally spilling its lethal cargo. In the sterile, locked-down silence of the office, the mole realized his mistake. He had accounted for every soldier, but he had forgotten to watch the woman who held the keys to every door. The blood on the Calicata marble had been scrubbed away, leaving the stone whiter and colder than before. In the restored silence of Unit 402, the Chicago skyline glittered like a jagged crown, but the man standing by the glass was no longer the only power in the room. Min-Yi turned, his silhouette sharp against the dawn. He didn't look at Naomi as a servant, nor as a secret to be kept. He looked at her as the person who had redesigned the blueprints of his survival. "The old world is gone, Naomi," he said, his voice stripped of the K-Campi's lethal frost. Ju-1 saw a maid, I saw a strategist who knows the weight of every key in this city. I don't want someone to clean my messes anymore. I want someone who can see them coming before they hit the floor. He slid a leather folder across the kitchen island, not a severance check, but a contract. It was an invitation to the inner circle, a role as the architect of discretion for an empire that desperately needed a new foundation. Naomi looked at the folder, then at the reflection of the woman in the window. She didn't see a ghost in a gray uniform anymore. She saw a woman who had stitched a king back together on a scarred oak table. She thought of her sister's law degree, now fully paid, and the invisibility that had once been her only shield. "I'm done with the shadows, Minyi," she said, her voice steady and resonant, claiming the space she had once moved through like a phantom. She reached out, her hand firm as she took the pen. "If I'm staying, I'm doing it in the light.